Imagine a secret lab where science became a weapon, hidden from history, erased from headlines, and known to only a few. During World War II, a covert Japanese unit carried out human experiments so shocking they were later buried beneath silence and politics. In the next hour, we'll lift that veil. Who ran it? What really happened? And why the world mostly forgot. Stay with me. The truth is worse than the rumors. During World War II, while the world focused on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, another kind of war was being waged, one that never made it to the headlines. Hidden deep inside occupied China, a secret Japanese facility known as Unit 731 was conducting experiments unlike anything the world had ever seen. But this wasn't just about weapons. It was about pushing the limits of human suffering in the name of science. Officially, Unit 731 was described as a water purification unit. In reality, it was one of the darkest human laboratories in modern history. Thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, and even children were subjected to horrific experiments under the banner of medical research. Yet, after Japan's surrender, much of this evidence vanished. And the people responsible walked free, protected in exchange for their data. In this video, we're uncovering the forgotten horrors of Unit 731. How it began, what really happened inside those walls, and why justice was never served. So stay with me till the end, because this isn't just a story of war. It's a story of how truth can be buried, even when millions demand answers. But before we uncover what really happened inside Unit 731, we need to understand why it was created in the first place and who gave the order to build a laboratory of nightmares. Chapter 1. The Birth of Unit 731, Japan's secret weapon of science in the early 1930s. The world was still recovering from the aftermath of World War I. Nations were rebuilding, borders were being redrawn, and new ideologies were taking shape. But deep within the rising empire of Japan, a secret plan was being set into motion, one that would forever stain the pages of history. At that time, Japan had already invaded Manchuria, a vast region in northern China, rich in natural resources. It was here that the seeds of a dark scientific empire were quietly planted. Under the pretext of public health and water purification, the Japanese Imperial Army began constructing a research facility unlike any other on Earth. The official name sounded harmless: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But within military circles, it had another name, Unit 731. Its purpose: to advance Japan's biological warfare capabilities, and to develop weapons that could wipe out entire populations without a single bullet being fired. The man who conceived this idea was Dr. Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but dangerously ambitious microbiologist. She believed that biological weapons could decide the future of warfare: silent, efficient, and devastating. To him, the human body was simply a subject of study, and morality was an obstacle standing in the way of progress. He convinced Japan's military leaders that if they mastered biological warfare, Japan could control not just Asia, but perhaps the world. And so, with full military funding and government secrecy, Construction began on a massive complex near the city of Harbin in 1936. From above, it looked like a normal military base. But behind the high walls and barbed wire stood over 150 buildings, laboratories, hospitals, workshops, dormitories, and even a crematorium. The entire area was sealed off from civilians. No one was allowed in or out without permission. The project was cloaked in total secrecy. Even workers and lower-ranking soldiers had no idea what was truly happening inside. To the outside world, it was simply a medical research station helping prevent diseases in the harsh climate of Manchuria. But the real goal was far more sinister: to understand how disease could be used, not cured. And the location wasn't chosen by chance. Manchuria provided the perfect cover: remote, under full Japanese control, and far away from international scrutiny. Local Chinese villages, already under occupation, became silent sources of test subjects referred to by Ishii as men, not as people, but as Maruta, meaning logs. Ishii's team grew rapidly, attracting scientists, doctors, and military officers who shared his obsession for discovery or simply wanted power and promotion. Under his command, Unit 731 became one of the most advanced biological research centers in the world. The unit's experiments aimed to study how diseases spread, how the human body reacts under extreme conditions, and how bacteria could be weaponized. But none of these details were ever meant to reach the public. Ishii made sure of that. The operation was buried beneath layers of military classification, and all communication was strictly controlled. By the late 1930s, Unit 731 was fully operational. Ishii had absolute authority. Entire trainloads of supplies and people arrived at the facility. The experiments were about to begin, and the name Unit 731 would soon become synonymous with terror and secrecy. But what drove Dr. Ishii to turn medicine, the art of healing, into a tool of destruction? Was it blind ambition, patriotism, or something even darker? The answer lies not just in his mind, but in the philosophy that shaped Imperial Japan itself. Because to understand Unit 731, we first need to understand the man who built it. In the next chapter, we'll step into the mind of the man behind it all, Dr. Shiro Ishii, and uncover how one man's vision for scientific dominance turned into one of history's darkest nightmares. Chapter 2: The Man Behind the Madness, Dr. Shiro Ishii's Vision. Every dark chapter in history begins with a person who believes they serving a greater purpose. For Unit 731, that person was Dr. Shiro Ishii, born in 1892 in Japan's Chiba Prefecture. Ishii grew up during a time when Japan was transforming, evolving from an isolated island nation into an emerging world power. The young Shiro was intelligent, curious, and remarkably ambitious. He was fascinated by science and medicine, and by the time he entered Kyoto Imperial University, his brilliance was already evident. Professors admired his intellect, but also noted his arrogance. Ishii believed science could not only heal, it could conquer. He saw scientific progress not as a means of understanding humanity, but as a weapon that could elevate Japan to global dominance. By the 1920s, Ishii had joined the Imperial Japanese Army's Medical Corps, where he quickly gained influence. Unlike many of his peers, he was bold, unafraid to speak directly to generals and politicians. He often made grand claims that future wars would not be fought with bullets, but with bacteria. To many, this sounded outrageous. But Ishii was persuasive. He argued that biological weapons were the ultimate form of power, invisible, unstoppable, and cheap to produce. In his mind, if Japan mastered this new kind of warfare, it could change the balance of world power forever. By the early 1930s, Ishii began traveling across Europe and the United States, studying the latest developments in bacteriology and chemical warfare. He visited laboratories, universities, and military facilities, taking notes on everything he could. But what fascinated him most wasn't the science itself, it was the potential. The potential to weaponize nature, to bend life and death to his will. When Ishii returned to Japan, he presented a bold proposal to the army: create a secret research division dedicated entirely to biological warfare. At first, his superiors hesitated. Japan was already stretched thin with its invasions and expanding empire. But Ishii had a powerful advantage: charisma. He promised results, innovation, and military supremacy. And eventually, he got what he wanted. In 1936, Ishii was appointed the head of what would officially be called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a title carefully crafted to disguise its true purpose. It sounded peaceful, even humanitarian. But behind that title was a vision rooted in control, dominance, and experimentation without limits. Ishii's leadership style was unlike any other. He ruled with absolute authority. Everyone in the facility, from scientists to soldiers, referred to him with a mix of respect and fear. Those who disobeyed him faced demotion or reassignment. Those who followed him were rewarded handsomely. He cultivated an atmosphere where morality was suspended, where science came before conscience. To Ishii, ethical boundaries were illusions created by weak minds. He believed that true progress demanded sacrifice and that history would one day justify his actions. Inside Unit 731, Ishii's obsession grew. He was known to arrive in the lab before dawn, inspecting every detail, reviewing data, and demanding results. He called his work pure research, but what he was truly building was a machine of systematic cruelty, driven not by hate, but by cold scientific curiosity. Yet Ishii didn't see himself as evil. In his own writings, he described himself as a pioneer, a man misunderstood by the world. He believed that his research would one day save Japanese lives on the battlefield by teaching them how to defend against biological attacks or use them more effectively against enemies. It was this twisted logic that allowed him to justify everything. In his eyes, those who suffered in his experiments were not people. They were data, points, numbers. Necessary losses for a greater scientific victory. But Ishii's genius wasn't only in science, it was in secrecy. He built an entire network of deception around Unit 731. He convinced government officials that his experiments were for national defense. He bribed reporters to stay silent. And when the occasional outsider grew suspicious, Ishii's political connections ensured those questions disappeared as quickly as they came. By 1939, Ishii's empire had expanded. He had not only built Unit 731 near Harbin, but had also established several smaller facilities across Manchuria and mainland China. Each one operated under his command, feeding information back to the central lab. The man who once dreamed of glory had become a ghost behind the scenes, a name spoken in whispers, associated with projects that didn't officially exist. Those who worked with him described him as both brilliant and chillingly detached. He demanded innovation but discouraged empathy. To Ishii, compassion was inefficiency. His goal wasn't to heal the human body, it was to understand its destruction. Yet deep inside, Ishii was driven by fear, the fear of falling behind Western powers. Japan's leaders often reminded him that their nation stood against giants like the United States and the Soviet Union. Ishii saw this as justification for everything. If Japan didn't innovate, it would perish. And he was determined not to let that happen. His dream was to create a weapon so powerful that it could make entire armies collapse without a single shot fired. A silent weapon that would make Japan invincible. And to him, that dream was worth any cost. As the years went on, Ishii's experiments grew more secretive, more ambitious, and more horrifying in scale. The facility's outer walls grew taller. Security tightened. And inside, the line between science and monstrosity vanished completely. The world had no idea what was happening behind those walls. Even Japan's own citizens were kept in the dark. What Ishii built in Manchuria would remain one of the best-kept secrets of the 20th century until decades later, when survivors and documents began to surface. But in 1940, as the war spread across Asia, Ishii's unit was ready. Unit 731 was now a fully operational biological weapons program supported by Japan's highest command and protected by silence. The next phase was about to begin, and it would reveal just how far Ishii was willing to go in the name of science. In the next chapter, we'll step through those sealed gates and see what life inside Unit 731 really looked like. A city within a city, where science and secrecy ruled every moment. And the world outside had no idea what was unfolding within. Chapter 3. Inside the facility, a city of secrets. Imagine a city that doesn't exist on any map. It's a place surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, and erased from public records. That was Unit 731, hidden on the outskirts of Harbin in northeast China. The facility stretched across more than 150 buildings, a self-contained world of laboratories, offices, barracks, and factories. From the outside, it looked like a typical military installation. But inside, it was a fortress of forbidden science, a city built to study life by destroying it. Every inch of Unit 731 was designed for control. The roads were perfectly aligned, buildings were numbered with precision, and strict routines governed every person who entered. It was a place where time felt frozen, and truth existed only in reports stamped top secret. Those who worked there followed a hierarchy. At the top sat Dr. Shiro Ishii, the commanding director, untouchable, respected, and feared. Beneath him were military officers, scientists, doctors, and technicians. At the bottom were guards, maintenance workers, and the people no one dared to talk about the test subjects. Inside the gates, life ran like clockwork. At dawn, soldiers patrolled the perimeter. Scientists arrived early, wearing white coats and surgical masks. They greeted each other with calm professionalism, as if walking into a hospital, not a place where unspeakable experiments were taking place. The main laboratory building was massive, several stories high, filled with rows of microscopes, glass jars, and instruments imported from Germany and the United States. Ishii spared no expense. He wanted the best equipment, the best brains, and absolute secrecy. Next to the labs stood administrative offices, where daily reports were typed, stamped, and filed away. Every result, every observation was documented in meticulous detail. Data was the lifeblood of Unit 731. It didn't matter where it came from, only that it was accurate. Further inside were dormitories for the scientists and officers. Many lived with their families, completely separated from the truth of what they were part of. For them, it was just another military posting, good pay, prestige, and security. Children played outside the compounds, unaware that only a few meters away, history's darkest medical experiments were unfolding. The facility also had factories and workshops where bacteria cultures were grown in massive vats. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and disinfectant. Trucks came and went, carrying supplies, sometimes even large wooden crates whose contents were never discussed. There were hospitals too, not for the sick, but for research. And nearby stood the crematorium, where smoke quietly rose day and night, blending with the cold Manchurian sky. Few dared to ask what was burning. What made Unit 731 even more terrifying was its efficiency. It wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was organized, planned, and executed with chilling precision. Everything had a protocol. Every action had a purpose. And everyone believed they were serving the Empire. Guards were told never to speak about what they saw. Scientists signed oaths of secrecy. Even law-level workers were warned that if they talked, they would vanish without a trace. Fear kept everyone silent, and silence made the machine run smoothly. To outsiders, the area around Pingfang, where Unit 731 stood, looked quiet and ordinary. Villagers nearby noticed military traffic, strange smoke, and sometimes distant cries at night. But under occupation, no one dared to question anything. Those who grew curious were taken away and never returned. Unit 731 also had its own airfield, a flat expanse of land where planes took off to test biological dispersal methods. It was here that researchers conducted large-scale field trials, releasing harmless bacteria to study how fast they spread through the air. At least, that's what official documents later claimed. But for the scientists inside, this was their empire of knowledge. They saw themselves as pioneers, mapping the boundaries of biology and life itself. To them, morality was irrelevant. What mattered was data, and Ishii made sure no one ever forgot it. In staff meetings, Ishii often reminded his subordinates that they were part of something greater than themselves, something that would make Japan scientifically unstoppable. He compared their work to that of explorers discovering new worlds, urging them to push forward no matter the cost. Over time, the line between researcher and soldier blurred completely. Doctors took orders like generals, and science became strategy. In their reports, they didn't write about people, they wrote about subjects, variables, and results. Human lives reduced to statistics on a page. But there was one thing Unit 731 could never fully control: the rumors. Occasionally, whispers spread among Japanese troops stationed nearby. Stories of a facility where strange medical experiments were conducted, or where infected prisoners were kept. But those who asked questions were quickly silenced. For years, these rumors were dismissed as wartime propaganda. Few could imagine that such a place could truly exist. And yet, it did. Hidden beneath layers of secrecy, protected by imperial authority, and powered by the ambitions of one man, Dr. Shiro Ishii, by 1940. Unit 731 had grown into a small city, employing thousands of personnel and operating day and night. It had its own farms, power stations, and communication lines. The outside world had no clue that one of the most advanced biological research facilities in history stood quietly in Manchuria. Every decision, every experiment, every silence, it all led to one goal: the creation of a weapon that could end wars in a single strike, a weapon that could make Japan untouchable. But the deeper Ishii and his team went, the more humanity they lost. And as the years passed, Unit 731 was no longer just a laboratory. It was a symbol of how far humans could go when morality was replaced by ambition. In the shadows of that frozen landscape, science had turned into something else, something monstrous, something hidden for decades beneath the dust of history. In the next chapter, we'll all uncover who the people inside those walls really were, the ones brought to Unit 731 against their will. Ordinary civilians, prisoners of war, and entire families who vanished into secrecy. Their names erased, but their stories still echo through time. Chapter 4. The Victims. Who were they? Every empire hides its secrets behind walls, but no wall is high enough to bury the truth forever. Inside Unit 731, behind the heavy iron gates and guarded watchtowers, there lived two worlds, one of privilege, the other of silence. On one side were the scientists, officers, and doctors following their daily routines with precision and purpose. On the other were those who were never meant to leave. The victims of Unit 731 came from many places. Chinese civilians, prisoners of war from Russia, Korea, and even some from allied nations. They were farmers, students, laborers, soldiers. Ordinary people caught in extraordinary cruelty. Many were taken from their villages in the dead of night, accused of helping resistance fighters, or simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Once captured, they were transported to Pingfang, often in sealed trucks or train wagons. Few knew where they were going. None knew they would never return. When they arrived, they were stripped of their identities. Their names, professions, and families were erased from record. They were assigned numbers, anonymous figures in a system that didn't recognize them as human. Within the compound, they were referred to by a single word, maruta, meaning logs. To the staff, this term made the unthinkable sound ordinary, a language designed to distance the experimenters from the reality of what they were doing. But these people were not numbers. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, individuals with lives, dreams, and loved ones who waited for them to come home. Among them were political prisoners, activists who resisted Japanese occupation, as well as captured soldiers from the Chinese army. Others were simple townspeople, a teacher, a merchant, a young mother. Entire families were sometimes taken together. The idea was to observe natural disease transmission to see how illness spread between relatives. In this way, Unit 731 transformed its victims into data, living statistics in a laboratory of silence. The conditions inside were severe. The compound was always cold, especially during Manchuria's brutal winters. The walls were thick, the corridors long, the air heavy with disinfectant. Prisoners were kept in isolation, never told why they were there, never allowed to speak to each other. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. For the guards and scientists, this became routine. The boundaries between duty and morality blurred so much that many no longer saw the captives as people. The language of research replaced the language of empathy. Orders came from above, and no one questioned them. But even in that darkness, small acts of humanity survived. Some guards would secretly pass bits of food or water to the captives. Whispering words of comfort they knew could cost them their lives if overheard. A few doctors, quietly horrified by what they witnessed, kept private notes, hoping that one day the truth would be known. Outside the compound, nearby villages began to notice strange patterns. People vanished without explanation. Entire households disappeared overnight. Yet, under occupation, fear silenced everyone. No one dared to approach the facility. The soldiers at the gates had orders to shoot anyone who came too close. The tragedy of Unit 731 wasn't just in the suffering of those inside. It was in the deliberate erasure of their existence. Records were destroyed, names deleted, photographs burned. For decades, the world didn't even know who these people were. They became ghosts, invisible victims of a hidden war. But fragments of their stories survived. After Japan's surrender, former employees spoke in whispers. Some confessed to their roles. Others, haunted by guilt, left behind letters and testimonies. Historians later uncovered traces, fragments of names, towns, and faces from old military documents. One researcher described finding a crumpled note in an abandoned drawer at the Harbin site, a single Chinese character scribbled by hand. It meant home. That word captures what every one of those victims lost. Not just their lives, but their connection to the world outside those walls. And yet, despite the silence, their memory endured. Survivors from nearby villages kept their stories alive, passing them down through generations so that one day the world would know. The victims of Unit 731 were not soldiers on a battlefield. They were not enemies in combat. They were people whose only crime was being under occupation at a time when science lost its soul. Their suffering became data. Their humanity became statistics. But their stories, even if incomplete, remain a testament to what happens when knowledge is used without conscience. Because every experiment, every report, every piece of data written inside Unit 731 came at a human cost that can never truly be measured. And in the shadows of those walls, Japan's so-called scientific triumph was built upon the silence of the innocent. In the next chapter, we'll look deeper into the heart of Unit 731's operations, exploring what kind of research was conducted, how science turned into a weapon, and how far Ishii's empire went in its pursuit of power. Chapter 5. The Experiments, the Limits of Humanity in Every Era of Science. There's a line, a boundary that separates curiosity from cruelty. Inside Unit 731, that line was not only crossed, it was erased. By the early 1940s, Unit 731 had become one of the most advanced research centers in the world. The facility's design allowed for multiple projects to operate simultaneously, each focusing on a different field of study. To an outsider, it looked like progress. To those inside, it was a system built to push the limits of what could be done to the human body, all in the name of knowledge and warfare. Each department had its own mission. Some studied the spread of bacteria and viruses. Others focus on how the body reacts under extreme conditions, temperature, pressure, or isolation. There were groups that specialized in animal-to-human transmission research, and others that developed defensive methods to protect Japan's own troops. At least, that was the justification written in official documents. The truth was far more complex. Every experiment conducted inside Unit 731 had two faces. The public face was scientific progress. The hidden face was the pursuit of military dominance. Dr. Shiro Ishii saw his work not as cruelty, but as a necessary sacrifice. In his speeches to his staff, he often said, "To protect 1,000,000 lives, a few must be lost in research." It was this kind of reasoning that allowed many intelligent, educated people to silence their conscience. They weren't monsters, they were scientists, doctors, and soldiers who believed they were serving a greater good. And that belief became their shield. Inside the laboratories, the work was methodical. Data was everything. Every observation, every sample, every reaction was carefully recorded. Reports were typed and archived with military precision. Scientists discussed their results calmly, like mathematicians solving a problem detached from what those numbers truly represented. In a twisted way, Unit 731 became a mirror reflecting what happens when human ambition loses its moral compass. The pursuit of discovery became more important than the sanctity of life. Many of the so-called experiments focused on studying how diseases spread and how long the body could resist infection. Others explored ways to protect Japanese troops from potential biological attacks, creating vaccines and protective gear based on their data. The irony was devastating. Life-saving knowledge extracted from the suffering of others. The scientific community within Unit 731 operated under an illusion of order and legitimacy. Departments were labeled, schedules followed, reports signed. There were meetings, promotions, and even awards for excellence. Everything about the place looked professional, except for what it was doing. One former researcher later described the facility as a place where science lost its humanity. He recalled how colleagues spoke of results and efficiency, but never of the human beings those results came from. That's what made Unit 731 so haunting. It was indeed driven by rage or hatred, but by cold detachment. The people inside didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers, explorers charting the unknown. Outside, the war raged on. Japan's empire was expanding across Asia, and the pressure on Ishii's team grew. Commanders demanded faster results, new data, and effective ways to weaponize their findings. Ishii responded with relentless ambition. He ordered larger-scale tests, more field operations, and greater secrecy. At times, entire regions of occupied China were used to study the spread of disease outbreaks under the claim of public health monitoring. Officially, the Japanese army said it was combating epidemics. Unofficially, it was observing them. These operations were reported directly to Japan's military high command. Ishii himself often presented his findings to senior generals in Tokyo, who praised his efficiency and promised him continued funding. What's perhaps most chilling is how ordinary this all seemed to those involved. Reports from surviving documents describe meetings filled with scientific enthusiasm, discussions about bacteria strains, infection patterns, and vaccine efficacy. For the participants, it was business as usual. For the victims, it was a nightmare with no voice. And yet, amid the silence of that frozen compound, some began to question what they were part of. Young researchers, freshly graduated and full of idealism, arrived expecting to contribute to medical progress only to discover the grim reality behind the locked doors. Some requested transfers. Others stayed quiet, knowing that refusal meant punishment or worse. A few quietly took notes, documenting what they saw, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps out of the faint hope that one day the world would know. By 1942, Ishii's empire had reached its peak. Unit 731 was no longer just a research base. It had become a cornerstone of Japan's wartime science. Dozens of smaller units were established across China and Southeast Asia, each following the same model. Inside those walls, experiments continued day after day, month after month, producing volumes of data that would later be hidden from the world. But the cracks were beginning to show. Japan was starting to lose the war, and Ishii knew that time was running out. He began preparing contingency plans, strategies to erase everything if the empire fell. And yet, he refused to stop. Even as Japan's cities burned and its armies retreated, Unit 731 continued to operate, feeding on secrecy, protected by the illusion of importance. The tragedy of these experiments isn't just in what was done, it's in what they represented. The moment when science turned its back on humanity, when intellect became an instrument of destruction instead of healing. Inside those laboratories, the brightest minds of Japan's medical corps became part of a dark equation, one where progress demanded silence and truth was rewritten by power. And as the empire began to crumble, Dr. Ishii faced a new challenge: how to protect his creation from discovery, and how to ensure that everything he done would not be in vain. In the next chapter, we'll witness how Japan's defeat changed everything, how Unit 731 tried to erase its own existence, and how the Empire's darkest secret nearly vanished from history forever. Chapter 6. The War's End. Erasing the evidence by the summer of 1945. The empire that once dreamed of conquering Asia was collapsing under its own weight. American bombers filled Japan's skies. Its cities lay in ruins, and whispers of surrender grew louder every day. Far away from Tokyo, deep in the quiet plains of Manchuria, the secret city of Unit 731 was still running, but its heartbeat had changed. Gone was the confidence, the ambition, the endless supply of resources. In its place, fear began to grow. Dr. Shiro Ishii knew what was coming. He had seen what happened to Germany's scientists after their defeat. He understood that the moment Japan surrendered, the world would come looking for answers and for evidence. Evidence that could destroy everything he had built and expose every secret his empire had buried. So, in the final months of the war, Ishii made his most calculated decision yet to erase Unit 731 from existence. Orders were sent to burn records, destroy documents, and eliminate all traces of the facility's operations. The once busy corridors of the complex turned into a frenzy of flames and smoke. Paper records that had taken years to collect, results, charts, notes were tossed into furnaces and pits. Whole storage buildings went up in smoke, filling the air with the ashes of history. But it wasn't just paper that vanished. Ishii knew that knowledge itself was dangerous, and knowledge lived in people. So he took an even darker step. Many of the staff who knew too much were relocated, silenced, or absorbed into other military divisions under new identities. The compound was stripped bare, laboratories dismantled, instruments buried, and walls collapsed with explosives. For the people who lived nearby, it looked like a military evacuation. But in reality, it was a cover-up of one of the largest human experiments in modern history. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Empire's leaders were forced to confront the unimaginable. The war was over. The dream of expansion was dead. And the victors were already closing in. As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, Unit 731's remaining staff fled in panic. Some boarded trains heading back to Japan under secret orders, while others disappeared into the chaos of retreating armies. By the time Soviet troops reached the compound, what they found was a ghost city, abandoned buildings, charred ruins, and eerie silence. Still, even in destruction, traces of the truth remained. Scattered notes, half-burned files, empty cages. Enough to suggest that something extraordinary and horrifying had taken place. There, Dr. Ishii himself returned to Japan under a false name, blending back into civilian life. He carried with him what couldn't be burned: his memory, his research, and his connections. But Ishii also knew something else. The United States, now Japan's occupier, was not only seeking justice, it was seeking information. The world had entered a new era, one where scientific knowledge could decide the fate of nations. And in that new world, the data collected by Unit 731 was no longer just evidence of war crimes. to as a treasure trove of biological warfare intelligence. When U.S. military investigators learned about the experiments, they were horrified, but also intrigued. The Cold War was beginning, and both America and the Soviet Union were racing to understand the limits of biological weapons. In that race, even dark knowledge had value. According to later declassified documents, American officials struck a secret deal with Ishii and his top scientists. In exchange for their data and cooperation, they would not be prosecuted for war crimes. The information gathered through inhumane means would be analyzed by U.S. intelligence agencies and quietly integrated into military research programs. It was a silent bargain, one that spared the guilty, silenced the truth, and buried justice. Publicly, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal never mentioned Unit 731. The Soviet Union conducted its own trials in 1949, convicting several members of Ishii's staff, but the West dismissed their claims as propaganda. And so, for decades, the story of Unit 731 remained locked away, buried under layers of political secrecy. For the survivors and their families, there was no closure. For the world, there was silence. But time has a way of uncovering what people try to hide. As years passed, fragments of testimony began to surface from former soldiers, nurses, and even scientists who could no longer carry the weight of their memories. Old photographs emerged. Abandoned buildings were rediscovered. And slowly, piece by piece, the world began to understand what had truly happened behind those iron gates. The destruction of Unit 731 had been nearly perfect, but not complete. Enough remained to reveal the outlines of something vast, a program so secret that it survived even its own death. But the end of the war wasn't the end of the story. Because in the years that followed, new questions began to rise. Where did Ishii go? What happened to his team? And how did a nation rebuild while its darkest secret still lived in silence? Chapter 7. The Aftermath, a silence that lasted decades when the guns finally fell silent. The world expected a reckoning, proof unearthed, perpetrators held to account, and victims given voice. In many places, that happened. But in the story of Unit 731, justice took a different path, one marked by silence, secrecy, and political calculation. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the geopolitical map of East Asia changed rapidly. Empires collapsed, new powers rose, and the Cold War began to shape decisions that would last for decades. In the middle of those shifting interests lay the fragile testimony of survivors. Half-burned files and a scattering of witnesses, all pointing to a program that had operated in plain sight for years. Yet, despite the mountain of evidence that would later be referenced by historians, for a long time the dominant public narrative in both Japan and the West ignored Unit 731. Several factors combined to keep it that way. First, there was the deliberate destruction of material evidence. Buildings were razed, documents incinerated, and records dispersed. Without neat stacks of files or full archives, the scale of the crime was harder to present to the world in a single, undeniable form. Investigators could find hints, fragments, and witness statements, but the full picture remained diffuse and partial. Second, the politics of the New World Order made many powers cautious. The Cold War pushed former enemies and allies into practical compromises. In that climate, intelligence and scientific data gained a new kind of currency. Information that could advance defense programs or inform biological countermeasures was suddenly valuable. For some Allied leaders, prosecuting scientists who could provide useful knowledge felt like a cost they were unwilling to pay. Third, cultural and domestic pressures in Japan contributed to the silence. After defeat, Japan focused on rebuilding and regaining stability. There was social fatigue, economic urgency, and political pressure to move forward. Many Japanese officials and civilians preferred to leave painful wartime topics in the past, especially subjects that might destabilize fragile post-war recovery or that implicated respected institutions. For survivors and witnesses, the aftermath was a lonely and dangerous time. Many were uncertain who to trust. Speaking out carried the risk of social stigma, of being labeled a troublemaker, or worse, of legal and physical retaliation. Those who tried to tell their stories often encountered disbelief, denial, and bureaucratic stonewalling. Yet, over the years, a slow, steady movement of truth-seeking began to form. A handful of former staff members, reluctantly or guilt-ridden, left accounts. Local villagers kept memories alive through whispered stories passed to children. Chinese investigators and journalists documented traces in the ruins. Academics slowly dug into archived military records and testimonies, connecting small fragments to build a coherent narrative. Public disclosure came in fits and starts. The Soviet Union released some information in its own trials and statements, and Chinese historians pursued their own investigations. In Japan, journalists and academics eventually began publishing essays and books that challenged the official silence. International scholars translated materials and cross-referenced testimonies with surviving military logs. Small but powerful documentaries, interviews, and exhibitions gradually pushed Unit 731 from rumor into recognized history. Alongside historical inquiry, legal and moral debates erupted. Ethicists, historians, and public officials argued over the responsibilities of post-war governments. Should scientific data obtained through inhumane means ever be used? Did strategic advantage justify immunity? These were not just academic questions. They were moral crises that shaped policy and public memory. In many ways, Unit 731 became a test case for how nations manage ugly truths. Some officials argued that exposing the depths of the crimes would inflame national guilt or international tensions. Others insisted that truth and accountability were essential for genuine reconciliation. That tension played out in parliamentary hearings, in courtrooms, and in quiet conversations between diplomats. Meanwhile, the human cost continued to echo. Survivors, often elderly by the time the wider public learned their stories, sought recognition, apologies, and compensation. Many found bureaucratic hurdles and partial acknowledgement, but few received the full justice they sought. Memorials and museums eventually opened in some places, but for decades, the faces of victims remained largely absent from mainstream narratives. A new generation of researchers, activists, and filmmakers helped keep momentum alive. They translated documents, recorded oral histories, and pressured institutions to release archives. Their persistence forced repeated re-examinations. Government records were revisited. Previously classified files were declassified in some countries, and archives that had been fragmented began to be reunited in public scholarship. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a marked shift. As the urgency of immediate post-war politics faded, more comprehensive histories emerged. International symposiums debated the ethics of wartime science. Museums curated exhibitions that treated survivors' testimonies with care. Educational programs, particularly in regions directly affected, began to teach the story of Unit 731 in historical context. Even so, the silence that followed the war left long-lasting scars. For families of the disappeared, official recognition often arrived decades too late. For some, it never arrived at all. For historians, gaps remain in the record, questions that may never be fully answered because the people who could answer them died in wartime, or whose records were intentionally destroyed. And yet, the persistent work of survivors, historians, journalists, and activists made one thing clear: silence can be broken, and historical memory can be reclaimed. Where initial post-war politics tried to bury the story, generations of inquiry gradually brought pieces of truth back into public view. This slow unearthing also sparked a broader conversation about the moral responsibilities of scientists and governments. Universities, medical associations, and international bodies opened discussions on research, ethics, consent, and the abuse of scientific authority in wartime. The legacy of Unit 731 informed policy debates about human experimentation and helped shape modern bioethical standards. The aftermath was therefore twofold: a period of dangerous silence shaped by immediate post-war calculations, and a slower ongoing process of recovery in which voices were recovered and recorded institutions were pressed for accountability and collective memory was rebuilt. But a new and even more controversial chapter is coming next. While much of the world sought accountability, secret deals were made in the shadows, deals that saved some perpetrators from prosecution in exchange for their data. In the next chapter, we'll examine those negotiations and the moral price they demanded. Chapter 8: The American Deal. Science over Justice in the Chaos That Followed Japan's Surrender. A quiet storm was brewing behind closed doors. While the world celebrated the end of war, a new struggle had begun, not on battlefields, but in offices, laboratories, and secret meetings. This struggle wasn't about territory or ideology. It was about information. The same knowledge that had fueled Japan's wartime horrors, the data from Unit 731, had suddenly become a coveted prize. And in the newly divided world of the Cold War, that information was worth more than justice itself. After Japan's defeat, the United States occupied the country with a mission: rebuild its government, dismantle its military, and prosecute war crimes through the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. But among the mountain of evidence the Allies uncovered, one subject was missing from the public trials: Unit 731. American intelligence officers had already begun piecing together reports from Manchuria. They found fragments of research, testimony from captured Japanese scientists, and Soviet interrogation documents describing large-scale human experiments. The evidence was overwhelming and politically inconvenient. At first, American investigators expressed outrage. They wanted names, files, and accountability. But soon, military strategists and intelligence analysts saw something else, something they believed could not be ignored. Unit 731's research, as unethical as it was, represented years of data on biological warfare, how diseases spread, how to control them, and how to protect troops against them. In an age when both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to gain dominance through science, that data could be invaluable. And so began one of the most controversial bargains of the post-war era. Declassified memos later revealed that U.S. officials, including those within the War Department and the Army's Chemical Corps, debated how to handle Japan's biological warfare scientists. Some recommended immediate prosecution. Others argued that the scientific knowledge gathered by Unit 731 could advance America's own defense programs and should be secured before the Soviets could reach it. The argument that one was the one rooted in strategy, not morality. In a secret agreement, the U.S. offered immunity to Shiro Ishii and many of his colleagues. In return, they were to hand over their research, explain their findings, and cooperate with American scientists. To justify this, internal reports described the data as unique and of great value to the United States. In other words, knowledge gained through human suffering was now seen as a national asset. As part of this deal, Ishii was never charged with war crimes. In fact, he reportedly continued working quietly in Japan, advising on health and sanitation projects under government contracts. His associates found positions in universities, medical institutions, and research centers, their pasts hidden, their expertise rewarded. Meanwhile, American scientists analyzed the data, incorporating portions of it into classified defense programs. The reasoning was simple and chillingly pragmatic. If this information could help prevent a future biological attack, then using it, even if it came from unethical means, was considered justifiable. But not everyone agreed. Even within the U.S. military, some officers expressed discomfort. They argued that granting immunity to those involved in Unit 731 was a betrayal of justice, and that the victims, thousands of innocent civilians and prisoners, were being erased from history in exchange for convenience. Yet their objections were quietly overruled. The Soviets, on the other hand, conducted their own trials in 1949, exposing many details of Unit 731's work. They accused the U.S. of covering up crimes and harboring war, criminals' accusations that Washington dismissed as propaganda. But decades later, when American archives were finally declassified, many of those Soviet claims were proven true. What emerged was a sobering reality. In the balance between morality and national interest, morality had lost. Justice had been postponed, perhaps permanently, in exchange for data that would remain classified for decades. And the victims. They had no names in the reports, no recognition in the trials, and no reparations from the governments that benefited from their suffering. Their stories were buried under layers of secrecy, known only to the few who had seen the documents firsthand. In the years that followed, This uneasy alliance between former enemies would quietly shape the scientific and military landscape of the Cold War. The U.S. had learned from Unit 731's legacy, not just in terms of biology, but in how far nations are willing to go when fear and power outweigh conscience. The official line for many years was silence. The world moved forward. Technologies advanced. And the names of Unit 731's leaders faded from memory, protected by the very governments that once condemned them. But history has a long memory. And as journalists and historians dug deeper, the truth began to resurface. Not as propaganda, not as rumor, but as documented fact, verified by once classified files and survivor testimony. What was once hidden in the shadows of Cold War politics was slowly dragged into the light, piece by piece, name by name. And with that light came a question that still echoes today. Was the pursuit of knowledge worth the price of justice? In the next chapter, we'll see how the truth finally began to break through, how survivors, journalists, and historians forced the world to confront what governments tried to forget, and how the memory of Unit 731 became a lesson that science can never exist without humanity. Chapter 9. Uncovering the Truth. Voices against silence for nearly 3 decades after World War II. The story of Unit 731 remained hidden beneath layers of political silence and public forgetfulness. Governments avoided it. Textbooks ignored it. Even those who had worked near the facility often spoke of it only in whispers. But silence has a breaking point. And in the 1980s, it finally began to crack. It didn't start with governments or institutions. It began with people, a handful of individuals who refused to let history remain buried. In Japan, a few courageous journalists started asking questions no one else dared to ask. They scoured libraries, tracked down former military doctors, and confronted officials who had long denied involvement. One of them famously said, "The truth was hidden not because it was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient." Their articles, published in small newspapers and magazines, triggered a wave of public curiosity. Readers began writing letters. Survivors came forward. And researchers realized that this was not just rumor, it was history waiting to be proven. At the same time, survivors in China, people from villages near the old Harbin compound, started sharing stories passed down through generations. They spoke of mysterious outbreaks, missing relatives, and soldiers who had once occupied their towns under the banner of public health. Local historians began recording these testimonies, matching them with wartime maps and military archives. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. Universities took notice. Academics in Japan, China, and later in the United States and Europe began to collaborate, exchanging information and publishing studies. By comparing survivor accounts with declassified Allied documents, they confirmed what many had suspected all along. Unit 731 had been real, and its operations far larger than anyone had publicly admitted. In 1984, a Japanese professor named Mori Masataka and a group of researchers published a groundbreaking report that openly discussed the activities of Unit 731. Their work broke decades of taboo, sparking intense public debate inside Japan. Some citizens were shocked, others defensive. But one thing was clear: the silence was no longer sustainable. Soon after, television, documentaries, and investigative programs aired, giving the story an emotional and visual presence that print alone could not achieve. Images of the abandoned facilities in Manchuria, interviews with aging scientists, and testimonies from survivors forced a new generation to confront a past their textbooks had erased. Internationally, museums and human rights organizations began collecting evidence and artifacts related to Unit 731, the Harbin site. Once overgrown and forgotten, was eventually turned into a memorial and museum, a place not of blame, but of remembrance. Its exhibits told the story with compassion and dignity, focusing not on the horror itself, but on what humanity must learn from it. Journalists continued to uncover declassified files from American and Soviet archives, confirming the political bargains that had protected Unit 731's leaders. The revelations reignited moral debate worldwide. Should knowledge obtained through unethical means ever be used, no matter how valuable? Scientists, ethicists, and educators discussed the case in classrooms and conferences, shaping new global standards for research, ethics, and human rights. As more evidence surfaced, Japanese citizens, especially younger generations, demanded transparency from their government. Civic groups organized exhibitions, remembrance ceremonies, and educational campaigns to honor victims and acknowledge historical responsibility. Their efforts represented something deeply human: the need to understand, to remember, and to make peace with truth. Through documentaries, books, and survivor testimonies, the forgotten story of Unit 731 began to reach audiences far beyond East Asia. It became not just a Japanese or Chinese tragedy, but a universal warning, a reminder that science without conscience leads to darkness, and that truth, no matter how delayed, has the power to heal. In time, several former Unit 731 members publicly admitted their participation. Some expressed remorse, acknowledging that they had convinced themselves it was for the greater good. Others said nothing, perhaps haunted by guilt too heavy to speak aloud. But even those partial confessions mattered. Each voice, each document, each record brought history one step closer to justice. Not in a courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those willing to listen. The uncovering of Unit 731's story became more than a search for facts. It became a lesson about collective memory, how societies must face their past, even when it hurts, if they wish to build an honest future. By the early 2000s, the world finally began to acknowledge what survivors had known all along: that beneath the ashes of war and the dust of archives lay a story too important to forget. A story that proved silence can be powerful, but truth, even whispered, endures longer. But as the truth emerged, a new question took shape. How should the world remember this? Should we focus on the pain or the lessons? In our final chapter, we'll explore how Unit 731's legacy reshaped science, ethics, and our very definition of humanity. Chapter 10: Legacy and Lessons, the Price of Forgetting. The story of Unit 731 is not just a hidden chapter of World War II. It's a haunting mirror, showing what happens when ambition outgrows humanity. For decades, the world tried to move on, to forget. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Today, the site of Unit 731 stands silent in Harbin, China. Its concrete ruins are cracked, weathered by time, but they whispered the echoes of what happened there. Tourists visit the museum that now stands on those grounds, some in disbelief, others in tears, trying to comprehend how science, which was meant to heal, was once used to destroy. The legacy of Unit 731 forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far would we go in the name of progress? Would we recognize the warning signs if they appeared again? And most importantly, what is the price of forgetting? Because history has a dangerous habit. It repeats itself when ignored. The crimes of Unit 731 were buried under politics and silence. But their lessons have shaped the foundation of modern bioethics. The Nuremberg Code, the Geneva Conventions, and the rise of international human rights all carry the shadows of what Ishii and his team once did. Out of horror, the world found the courage to say, "Never again." Yet, in some ways, the world still struggles with that promise. When nations justify cruelty as research, when secrecy hides suffering, when ethics are treated as optional, we are reminded that Unit 731 isn't just history, it's a warning. The victims had no voices, but you do. By remembering them, by learning what truly happened, we make sure their silence was not in vain. We make sure the next generation knows the cost of unchecked power. So as this story ends, and as the ruins of Unit 731 fade into the horizon, remember, every experiment, every innovation, every discovery must serve humanity, not destroy it. Because the moment we forget that, we risk becoming what we once condemned. If you found this story eye-opening, help others discover it too. Like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to Decoding History and Science for more untold truths from our past. Your support helps us keep history alive and make sure it's never forgotten.